A woman vanishes from a locked house in the middle of a snowstorm. No broken window, no forced door, no blood, just an open front door, a purse full of cash left untouched, and a 6-year-old boy who wakes up completely alone. For 22 years, nobody knows what happened to her. And then one rainy Tuesday night, her son finds a single photograph in a government database, and everything the police thought they knew about this case falls apart in an instant. What he discovers underneath an abandoned locksmith shop in the middle of the Michigan woods will make you question how well you really know the quiet, ordinary people living around you. Stay until the end, because the final twist in this story is something almost nobody sees coming. Rockford, Michigan sits just north of Grand Rapids, tucked between thick pine forests and rivers so cold they never fully lose their bite, even in the middle of July. In the early 90s, it was the kind of town where nobody bothered locking their doors during the day, where kids rode their bikes in loose circles around the block until the streetlights flickered on and called them home, and where everybody, without exception, knew everybody else by their first name. It was slow. It was safe. It was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted to disappear from something else. That's exactly why Clara Higgins chose it. She was 28 years old, and she had come to Rockford a few years earlier, carrying almost nothing but a suitcase, a car, and a 6-year-old boy who trusted her more completely than anyone else on earth ever would. She was running from something. She didn't talk about it much, not even to her closest friends at the post office where she worked, but there was a particular kind of quiet in Clara, a watchfulness behind her warm smile, that suggested she had left more behind her than furniture and a lease. She worked the counter at the small-town post office 5 days a week, and if you ever stood in line behind her, you'd have noticed something small but telling. She remembered things. She remembered which families were waiting on letters from sons and daughters away at college. She remembered birthdays. She kept a chipped glass jar of butterscotch candies on the counter, just for the kids who tagged along with their parents, and she crouched down to their eye level and let them pick 2, never 1, always 2, because she said one candy was never quite enough for a kid who'd waited patiently in a long line. Being a single mother in a town like Rockford wasn't easy. There was no extra income, no safety net, no one to call at 2 in the morning when a fever spiked or a nightmare hit. But Clara never let the exhaustion show. Her entire world, every ounce of energy she left after a long shift, revolved around one small boy with a mop of messy brown hair and startlingly bright blue eyes. Julian. He was quiet, watchful, in the way children raised by a single, careful parent often are. He noticed things adults missed, a shift in his mother's tone, the way she glanced twice at a car idling too long outside their house, the particular hush that would fall over her whenever a stranger asked too many questions about where they used to live. He didn't understand any of it yet. He just knew that his mother was his entire universe, and he was hers, and that the two of them moved through the world like a single unit, bound by something unbreakable. There was one detail Julian would remember for the rest of his life, long after everything else about his childhood blurred at the edges. On the back of his mother's right shoulder, just below her collarbone, was a birthmark. It was roughly the size of a silver dollar, dark against her skin. It wasn't just some formless blotch. It was shaped unmistakably, like a jagged 5-pointed star. When Julian was small enough to still be carried, he would trace that star with his index finger while his mother held him, half asleep, humming something under her breath. She used to laugh, soft and low, and tell him it was her own personal lucky star, stamped right onto her skin, so that no matter how dark things got, she'd always have something to guide him home by. To Julian, that little star wasn't just a birthmark. It was a physical proof that his mother existed, that she was real, that she was his. It became, without either of them realizing it, the single detail that would matter more than anything else in the world 22 years later. The first week of November 1994 brought a brutal cold front sweeping down from Canada, blanketing the whole state in a hard, unyielding frost. The sky stayed the color of wet concrete for days on end, and the wind rattled the old wooden window frames of the small, single-story rental house Clara and Julian called home on the edge of town. Friday, November 11th began like any other day, utterly, completely unremarkable, which is exactly what makes it so haunting in hindsight. Clara finished her shift at the post office at 5 o'clock, waving goodbye to the postmaster the way she always did. and drove her aging blue sedan to the elementary school to collect Julian from the after-school program. From there, they went to the grocery store, wandering the aisles together, picking out toppings for their homemade Friday night pizza, a tradition so sacred between them that neither would have dreamed of breaking it. The cashier at that store would later remember them clearly, telling police that Clara had seemed happy that evening, relaxed, entirely absorbed in making her son laugh over something silly. Maybe a joke about pineapple on pizza, maybe just the easy warmth of a mother who had, for once, nothing urgent weighing on her mind. They got home just as the freezing rain began to fall, and spent the evening exactly the way they always did, sitting cross-legged on the living room carpet, eating pizza straight off paper plates, watching cartoons flicker across their old boxy television set. The house smelled like melted cheese and burnt crust edges. It was warm. It was safe. It was, in every measurable way, a perfectly ordinary Friday night. At 8:30, Clara carried a drowsy Julian down the short hallway to his bedroom. She helped him into his pajamas, tucked the heavy winter blankets tight around his small shoulders, and sat on the edge of his bed to read him a story, the way she did every single night without fail. When his eyes finally started to flutter shut, she leaned down and kissed his forehead. She smoothed back his messy hair. She whispered that she loved him, and she promised, the way mothers do, without ever imagining the promise might not hold, that she'd be right there when he woke up in the morning. She flicked on his small plastic nightlight. She walked out into the hallway, and she pulled his bedroom door mostly shut behind her, leaving just a sliver open so the dark wouldn't scare him if he woke. That was the last time Julian ever heard his mother's voice. Saturday morning came in slow and gray. The sun hadn't broken through the heavy storm clouds yet, and Julian's bedroom was bathed in that dim, cold light that makes everything feel slightly unreal. The first thing he noticed wasn't a sound. It was the temperature. The house was freezing, far colder than it should have been, colder than any Saturday morning he could remember. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, pulling the blanket tight around his shoulders, and called out for his mother, expecting the familiar clatter of coffee mugs and cereal bowls from the kitchen. Instead, there was nothing, a silence, so total it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. He climbed out of bed. His bare feet hit the freezing hardwood floor, and he padded down the short hallway, peeking first into his mother's room. Her bed was empty. The blankets were pushed aside, exactly as if she'd just gotten up moments ago, except she wasn't there, and the sheets had already gone cold. He walked into the living room. The television was off. The kitchen was empty. And then he turned toward the front entryway, and something in his small chest seized up with a fear he had no name for yet. The front door was standing wide open. The freezing November wind was pouring straight through the doorway, carrying sharp needles of rain onto the living room carpet, turning the small warm house into an icebox in a matter of hours. Julian walked slowly toward the open door, called for his mother again, his voice starting to tremble. He looked out at the driveway. Her blue sedan was still parked in its usual spot, coated in a thin, undisturbed layer of morning ice. Then he turned and looked at the small wooden table by the front door. Her purse was sitting right there, untouched. Her keychain, house keys and car keys both, resting beside it. And hanging on the brass hook above the table was her thick winter coat, the one she never, under any circumstances, left the house without in weather like this. That was the moment panic fully swallowed him. Because even at 6 years old, Julian understood, on some deep instinctive level, 3 things with total certainty. His mother would never leave the front door open. She would never leave without her coat in this cold. And she would never, ever, under any circumstance on earth, leave him alone. He ran, barefoot, in his pajamas, straight out into the freezing rain, sprinting across the frosted grass to the house next door. He pounded on the neighbor's front door with both fists, sobbing so hard he could barely breathe. An elderly woman named Mrs. Gable opened the door and froze at the sight of him, a soaked, shaking, terrified little boy standing on her porch in the middle of the storm. She didn't ask questions first. She pulled him inside, wrapped him in a heavy quilt, and only once he'd stopped hyperventilating enough to speak did she learn what had happened. The front door was open. His mother was gone. Mrs. Gable didn't hesitate for even a second. She picked up her kitchen phone and dialed 911. Within 15 minutes, two Rockford police cruisers pulled up onto the wet grass outside Clara's house, their lights cutting red and blue streaks through the gray morning. A veteran detective named Russell Thorne stepped out of his vehicle. Thorne was a large man, methodical to his core, the kind of investigator who'd seen nearly everything a small Michigan town could produce over the course of a long career. But a case involving an abandoned child, that particular kind of scene always turned his stomach, no matter how many years he'd been doing this. He and his deputies swept the house with weapons drawn, room by room, closet by closet, down into the small basement and out into the backyard. Nothing. No one. The property was completely, eerily empty. Thorne walked back into the living room, holstered his weapon, and started taking the details with the slow, deliberate attention of a man who knew that the smallest things were usually the ones that mattered most. And what he saw confused him more with every passing second. The house was pristine. No overturned furniture. No shattered glass. No muddy footprints tracked across the carpet. No blood anywhere. Nothing that so much as hinted at a struggle. He pulled on a pair of latex gloves and opened Clara's purse sitting on the entryway table. Her wallet was inside, untouched. He opened it and found over $80 in cash, her driver's license, her credit cards, all of it completely intact. He looked again at the winter coat hanging on its hook, and then out through the open door at the freezing rain hammering down on her parked car. And that's when the full, terrifying weight of the situation began to settle over him. This wasn't a robbery. No thief on earth leaves cash sitting untouched in an open purse. And this wasn't a woman who had simply walked out on her life. A devoted single mother does not abandon her 6-year-old son in the dead of freezing night, walking out into a brutal winter storm without her coat or money or her car. Someone had been inside that house, while Julian slept 15 feet away. But when Thorne examined the heavy brass lock on the front door and then checked every single window latch in the house, one detail brought his entire investigation to a dead stop before it had even really begun. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere. Not a scratch. Not a dent. Nothing. How does someone get into a locked house, walk quietly past a sleeping child, take a grown woman out into a snowstorm without a single sound, and leave absolutely no trace behind? That question would haunt Detective Russell Thorne for the next 22 years of his life. The lack of forced entry turned what should have been a straightforward missing persons case into something that felt almost impossible. Thorne stood in that freezing living room running the scenario over and over in his mind. Someone had bypassed a locked door, walked quietly through a sleeping house, taken a healthy adult woman out into a brutal storm, and done it all without waking a notoriously light-sleeping, highly observant 6-year-old boy sleeping just down the hall. He walked next door to check on Julian, who was sitting on the edge of Mrs. Gable's sofa, wrapped in a heavy patchwork quilt, both small hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate that had long since gone lukewarm. The boy wasn't shivering from the cold anymore. He was shivering from something far worse, the crushing, disorienting shock of waking up completely alone in a world that, until that morning, had felt entirely safe. Thorne took off his coat, unclipped his radio, and knelt down so he was at Julian's eye level. He kept his voice soft, gentle, careful, the way you'd talk to any frightened child, but especially one who might be the only witness to whatever had happened in that house. Julian's answers broke his heart precisely because they were so ordinary. He talked about the pizza, the cartoons, his mother reading him a bedtime story. When Thorne gently asked if he'd heard anything strange during the night, a knock at the door, a car in the driveway, footsteps on the porch, Julian just shook his head, tears spilling silently down his cheeks. He told the detective he'd slept the whole night through. The last thing he remembered was his mother switching on his nightlight and promising she'd be there when he woke up. With no other family nearby, Thorne arranged for Julian to be placed with Child Protective Services, while police scrambled to locate any relative who could take him. That afternoon, the call went out to Clara's older sister, Martha, who lived 4 hours away in Detroit. Martha got in her car the moment she hung up the phone and drove straight through the freezing rain, arriving at the Rockford police station in a state of total, blinding panic. When she was finally brought to Julian, she dropped to her knees in front of him, wrapped her arms around his small frame, and sobbed into his messy hair. She took immediate legal custody of her nephew, promising the officers standing nearby and promising herself that she would never let him out of her sight again. With Julian safe, Detective Thorne threw everything the department had into the search. What followed was one of the largest, most coordinated search efforts the county had ever mounted. The freezing rain slowly gave way to a heavy, blinding snowfall, turning an already brutal search into something close to unbearable. More than 100 volunteers, bundled in thick winter coats and bright orange hunting vests, formed long shoulder-to-shoulder lines and marched through the dense pine forest surrounding Rockford, using long wooden poles to probe through the drifts. State police brought in a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging, sweeping low over the frozen fields in search of any trace of body heat. Because Clara's rental house sat less than a mile from the Rogue River, a specialized dive team was called in as well. The water was dangerously close to freezing, and the divers, wrapped in heavy insulated wetsuits, had to break through thin sheets of surface ice just to get underneath. They dragged the muddy riverbed for 3 grueling days. They found absolutely nothing. The bloodhounds lost the scent almost immediately, right at the edge of the wet asphalt driveway. The heavy rain had washed away any trace of a trail before the dogs even arrived. There was no discarded clothing in the woods, no sign of a struggle near the riverbank, no footprints in the snow that led anywhere useful. Clara Higgins had simply vanished, swallowed whole by the freezing dark of a Michigan winter. With the physical search yielding nothing, Thorne turned his focus toward Clara's personal life, hoping the answer might be hiding somewhere in her past rather than in the frozen woods around her home. Detectives spent days conducting long, exhaustive interviews with anyone who'd ever crossed paths with her: the postmaster, grocery store clerks, the parents of Julian's classmates. The picture that emerged was remarkably, almost frustratingly consistent. Clara was loved by everyone who knew her. She had no known enemies, no outstanding debts, no history of substance abuse. She was, by every account, a woman entirely devoted to her son, with nothing in her present life that suggested any reason for her sudden disappearance. Her bank accounts were balanced. There had been no unusual withdrawals in the weeks before she vanished. Whatever had happened to Clara Higgins, it wasn't something she had chosen. But as Thorne dug further back, into years before she arrived in Rockford, he finally hit something. 3 years earlier, Clara had lived in a different city entirely. According to old police reports, she had packed her belongings into her car in the middle of the night and fled across state lines, seeking exactly the kind of quiet, anonymous fresh start that Rockford offered. And the reason for that flight was chilling. Clara had been running from a violently abusive, deeply possessive ex-boyfriend named Sailors Reed. Thorne pulled the old case files. The history was ugly. Sailors had repeatedly threatened Clara whenever she tried to end the relationship. He'd stalk her outside her workplace. He'd once been arrested for throwing a brick through her living room window in a fit of rage. Clara had moved to Rockford specifically to disappear from him, keeping her new address off every public registry she could protect herself and her son. For Thorne, this felt like the break the case desperately needed. An abusive ex with documented history of stalking and violence fit the profile perfectly. A man capable of tracking down a locked door, entering silently, and taking a woman out into the freezing dark. Within 48 hours, with federal warrant secured, Sailors Reed was located in a rundown apartment complex hundreds of miles from Rockford. A team of armed detectives kicked in his door before dawn, pulling him out of bed and cuffing him before he even had time to fully wake up. Thorne drove out personally to conduct the interrogation, dropping a thick manila folder onto the metal table between them. Sailors, now 32, sat across from him with an arrogant, unbothered smirk plastered across his face, tattoos climbing both arms. Thorne leaned in and hit him with everything. The accusation that he'd tracked Clara down, driven to Rockford in the dead of night, broken into her house, and taken her. He demanded to know where she was. Sailors didn't flinch, didn't ask for a lawyer. He just leaned back in his chair and let out a short, mocking laugh. "You're wasting your time, detective," he said. "I haven't seen Clara in 3 years. And I definitely wasn't in Michigan Friday night." When Thorne pushed for his alibi, Sailors calmly explained he'd been working an overnight shift as a machine operator at a large commercial printing factory. He told the detective to go check the punch clocks, talk to the supervisor. 2 detectives were sent immediately to verify it. When they called back an hour later, The news landed like a lead weight in Thorne's stomach. Sailor Reed's alibi was airtight, undeniably mechanically airtight. His time card showed him clocking in at exactly 6 o'clock Friday evening. The floor supervisor confirmed he'd operated a printing press for the full 12-hour shift. And the factory's grainy black and white security footage clearly showed him hauling boxes of paper across the floor at 2 in the morning. The exact hour Clara had vanished from her house, hundreds of miles away. It was physically, geographically impossible for Sailor Reed to have been anywhere near Rockford that night. He walked out of the police station a free man, leaving Detective Thorne standing alone in an empty hallway with absolutely no other leads. No suspects, no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no abandoned vehicle, just a locked door, an empty house, and a case that was rapidly turning to ice, right along with the ground it happened on. As the weeks bled into months, the crushing reality of an unsolved case settled over the Higgins family like a permanent fog. Martha formally adopted Julian, moving him to Detroit to try and put some distance between him and the empty house that haunted his sleep. He struggled for years with nightmares of open doors and freezing rain, developing a habit, one he never fully outgrew, of checking every lock in his aunt's house each night before bed. But the one thing that never faded, no matter how many years passed, was a memory of that star-shaped birthmark on his mother's shoulder. It stayed with him, sharp and unblurred, long after everything else about his early childhood had softened into vague impressions. The local news eventually moved on. The bright yellow missing person flyers taped the windows of the Rockford grocery store curled and faded in the sun until Clara's smiling face was barely recognizable anymore. But Detective Thorne couldn't let it go. It followed him home. It sat with him at dinner. He had a daughter close to Julian's age, and the thought of some faceless predator slipping through a locked door in the middle of the night, without leaving a single trace, kept him staring at his bedroom ceiling long after everyone else in his house had fallen asleep. 3 months after Clara disappeared, the lease on her rental house officially expired. The landlord called the department to let them know a cleaning crew was coming the next morning to clear out her remaining belongings so the house could be rented again. Thorne decided to make one final visit, alone, under cover of a quiet, freezing February night. He let himself in with the key the landlord had provided and stepped into the dark, silent living room. The house smelled like stale air and settled dust. He walked slowly down the hallway, sweeping his flashlight into each empty room, hoping against hope that his experienced eyes had somehow missed something the first time around. He stepped into Clara's bedroom. Her bed was still unmade, exactly as it had been the morning she disappeared, as though time itself had simply stopped moving in that one room. He opened her closet and ran his hand along the row of hanging winter coats, frustrated by the sheer, agonizing lack of answers. And then, kneeling down to check the baseboards inside that dark closet, his flashlight beam caught something unusual. Pushed all the way into the back corner, hidden beneath a folded winter blanket, sat a small, dark wooden cigar box. Thorne pulled on fresh gloves. He lifted the box out carefully and set it down on the carpet. It was coated in a thick layer of dust, clearly untouched for a long time. He flipped the small brass latch and lifted the lid. Inside, there was no money, no hidden letters, no secret diary, just a thick stack of glossy, full-color photographs resting neatly in the center of the box. He picked up the stack and started flipping through them under the beam of his tactical flashlight, and a wave of pure, sickening dread rolled through his chest with every image. These were not family photos. They were surveillance photographs, deeply invasive, deeply unsettling. Clara cooking dinner in her kitchen. Clara watching television on the living room carpet. Clara reading a book on the sofa. Every single shot had been taken from outside the house, in total darkness, looking into the glowing windows. Someone had been standing outside that house for months, watching every single move Clara made in private, unguarded moments of her own home. But it was the very last photograph in the stack that finally answered the question that had haunted the entire investigation from day one. It wasn't a picture of Clara at all. It was a close-up, perfectly focused shot of a small brass house key. The key wasn't sitting on Clara's entryway table. It was resting on top of a heavily scratched metal workbench, surrounded by tiny brass shavings. The predator hadn't picked the lock. He hadn't forced the door. He'd taken a photograph inside a hardware store or a locksmith shop. He had stolen a copy of Clara's house key, duplicated himself on a metal key-cutting machine, and simply walked in the front door while she slept. Standing alone in that freezing, empty bedroom, Detective Thorne understood immediately that this box hadn't been dropped there in a panic. It had been placed there deliberately, on the exact night of the abduction. It was a message, a taunt. Whoever had done this wanted the police to find those photographs. He wanted them to know he'd been watching Clara in the dark for months, and he wanted them to see that photograph of the duplicated key, proof that he'd outsmarted every single one of them. Thorne carried that photograph to every hardware store, locksmith, and metal shop within a 50-mile radius, showing it owner after owner, begging someone to recognize the distinctive scratch marks on that workbench. But a scratched metal table in a blue-collar Michigan town was about as common as it gets. Nobody recognized it. Without a name, without a location, the trail went cold, and it stayed cold for 22 years. 22 years is a long time. Long enough for an entire life to be built and rebuilt from the ashes of a single terrible night. Julian Higgins was now 28 years old, having grown up in Detroit under fierce, unwavering protection of his Aunt Martha. Somewhere along the way, the traumatized 6-year-old boy who'd once pounded on a neighbor's door in the freezing rain had grown into an extraordinarily kind, deeply empathetic young man, one who had chosen, quite deliberately, to spend his life helping others through their darkest moments. He became an emergency room trauma nurse, working long, grueling shifts at a busy city hospital, holding the hands of terrified strangers and telling them, over and over, that they weren't alone. It was work that suited him in a way few people around him fully understood. He knew, better than almost anyone, exactly what it felt like to wake up into a nightmare with no one there to hold your hand. But underneath his calm, professional exterior, Julian carried a wound that had never truly healed. He had never once stopped looking for his mother. His small Detroit apartment told the story better than he ever could out loud. Filing cabinets, thick binders, corkboards covered edge to edge with missing person flyers and printed case files. Every night, after finishing a brutal 12-hour shift, he'd sit down at a computer with a mug of black coffee and comb through the National Missing and Unidentified Persons database, scrolling through thousands of digital files, studying age-progressed sketches and unidentified Jane Doe reports from across the entire country, hoping, always hoping, for even the smallest trace of her. On a quiet, rainy Tuesday night in November 2016, 22 years to the week since his mother had vanished, Julian was scrolling through a newly digitized batch of unidentified women's cases from the Midwest. One file caught his attention. It had just been uploaded from a stack of old paper records that had apparently never made it into the digital system until now. The file belonged to a Jane Doe who had been found in 1999, 5 years after Clara disappeared. According to the attached police report, the unidentified woman had been discovered wandering aimlessly down the center of freezing, isolated rural highways somewhere in northern Michigan. She'd suffered a severe traumatic brain injury, almost certainly from being struck by a passing commercial truck in the dark, and the trauma, combined with clear signs of long-term physical abuse, had left her in a state of profound dissociative amnesia. She couldn't speak, couldn't write, couldn't remember her own name. For 17 years, she'd lived as a ward of the state in a long-term psychiatric care facility, completely anonymous. To protect patient privacy, there were no photographs of her face anywhere in the public database. But as Julian scrolled to the very bottom of the digital file, he found one clinical photograph, uploaded by an intake nurse back in 1999, a close-up shot of distinct, unique physical marker kept on file for potential family identification purposes. Julian stared at his monitor. The breath left his lungs so completely that for a moment he genuinely couldn't move. His coffee mug slipped from his fingers and shattered against the floorboards, and he didn't even react to the sound. The photograph showed the back of the Jane Doe's right shoulder. Just below the collarbone, there was a large, dark birthmark, the exact size of a silver dollar, shaped unmistakably like a jagged 5-pointed star. It was his mother's lucky star. His hand shook so badly he could barely unlock his phone, but he managed to dial the number for retired Detective Russell Thorne. Thorne was 70 years old now, living quietly near a lake, mostly retired from the world entirely. But the moment he heard the raw, suffocating emotion in Julian's voice, he didn't ask a single clarifying question. He simply said he was on his way. The next morning, the two of them drove 4 hours north to the state psychiatric facility, a large, quiet brick building surrounded by tall pines, the kind of place that seemed designed to be forgotten. They met with the lead physician in his office first, and he gently warned them to manage their expectations. The Jane Doe was completely nonverbal, deeply withdrawn, and suffered from severe post-traumatic stress. She had lived, in every meaningful sense, inside her own private world for 17 years. Julian nodded, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The doctor led them down a quiet, brightly lit hallway and slowly pushed open the door to a private room. Sitting in a comfortable armchair by the window, staring out at the falling snow, was a woman, 56 years old now. Her hair, once a deep, vibrant brown, had gone completely silver. Her face carried the deep lines of unimaginable, unspoken suffering. But when she slowly turned her head away from the window and looked toward the doorway, Julian saw her eyes. Bright blue, exactly as he remembered. It was Clara. Julian's knees gave out beneath him right there on the linoleum floor. A sound tore out of his throat that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a scream. Something raw and overwhelming. 22 years of grief and hope colliding all at once. He crawled toward her chair, reaching out with trembling hands, and gently took her pale, fragile fingers in his own. "Mom!" he choked out, tears streaming freely down his face as he dropped his head into her lap. "Mom, it's me. It's Julian. I found you." Clara didn't speak. The traumatic brain injury had permanently locked away her ability to form words, years ago, in a way that no amount of hoping could undo. She looked down at the grown man sobbing in her lap, her blue eyes confused, clouded, searching for something she couldn't quite name. But when Julian reached up and gently touched the star-shaped birthmark on her shoulder, something ancient and unbreakable stirred beneath the fog of her amnesia. Her lower lip began to tremble. A single tear rolled down her weathered cheek. Slowly, she raised a shaking hand and buried her fingers in his messy brown hair, smoothing it back exactly the way she used to when he was 6 years old and falling asleep in her arms. She didn't know her own name anymore, but somewhere, in a place far deeper than memory, her soul recognized her son. Detective Thorne stood in the doorway, openly weeping, watching a reunion he had genuinely believed was impossible. But even as he witnessed this miracle unfolding in front of him, something else was building in his chest, a slow, cold, unyielding fury. Clara was alive, but whoever had stolen 22 years of her life, whoever had abused her for 5 brutal years and forced her to flee onto a dark highway in terror, was still out there, still free. Thorne didn't waste a single second. He walked straight to the facility's front desk and requested a hard copy of the original 1999 police report, the one detailing exactly where Clara had been found. The report placed her along the shoulder of County Road 9, a few miles outside a small, isolated logging town called Blackwood, nearly 2 hours north of where she'd originally vanished. And instantly, Thorne's mind flew back to that photograph. The brass house key resting on a heavily scratched metal workbench. Whoever had taken Clara possessed heavy machinery. A metal shop, the kind of place you find in exactly a town like Blackwood. He contacted the state's commercial business registries, requesting historical records for any hardware stores, metal fabrication shops, or locksmiths operating in that county between 1994 and 1999. The list came back short, barely more than a handful of businesses in a town that small. And there was only one independent locksmith operating in that specific 5-year window, Blackwood Security and Lock. Thorne pulled the ownership records, and when the name appeared on the screen, a jolt of pure adrenaline shot through his entire body. The owner was a man named Martin Hess. A comprehensive background check followed almost immediately, cross-referencing Hess's residential history against Clara's, and the connection snapped into place with sickening clarity. Before Martin Hess ever moved to remote, isolated Blackwood and opened his locksmith shop, he had lived in the exact same city where Clara had lived before fleeing to Rockford. More than that, he had worked there as the primary maintenance man for the very apartment complex where Clara used to live. Suddenly, the entire psychological profile of the crime rearranged itself. The police had spent years focused entirely on Clara's abusive ex-boyfriend, never once looking twice at the quiet, unremarkable maintenance man who had access to every single unit in her old building, including a master key to her front door. Martin Hess had become dangerously, obsessively fixated on Clara. When she fled to Rockford to escape her ex, Hess had used his old maintenance records and connections to track down her new address. He had stolen a copy of her house key, taken it back to his own metal shop to duplicate it, and photograph his work like some kind of sick trophy. He had walked into her quiet home while she was reading her son a bedtime story and taken her out into the freezing rain without leaving a single trace. Thorne pulled the current property records for Hess. The locksmith shop in Blackwood had officially shut its doors back in 2001, just 2 years after Clara had escaped and been struck by that truck. But Hess had never sold the building. He kept it, sitting empty and abandoned, while he lived a few miles away in a small trailer, entirely off the grid. Thorne wasted no time. He contacted the state police and organized an immediate, heavily armed tactical raid, calling in backup forensic teams, and a judge willing to sign an emergency search warrant at 4 a.m. A convoy of blacked-out tactical vehicles rolled silently through the snow-covered forests of northern Michigan, turning off the main highway onto a long, overgrown dirt road that led deep into the woods, ending at the abandoned property of Blackwood Security and Lock. The building itself was a weathered cinder block structure, standing utterly alone in the dark trees, its windows boarded up with rotting plywood, its roof sagging beneath the weight of the season's heavy snowfall. The tactical team moved swiftly across the frozen mud. The breacher swung a heavy steel ram against the rusted iron door, snapping it clean off its hinges. Thorne and the officers flooded inside, sweeping blinding flashlight beams of the pitch-black, dust-choked interior. Inside was chaos, towering shelves of rusted metal parts, old brass keys scattered across every surface, broken machinery gathering dust in every corner. Thorne pushed his way toward the back of the massive room, his heart hammering with a rhythm he could feel in his own throat. And there, sitting in the center of the dusty concrete floor, illuminated by his flashlight beam, was a heavy metal workbench. He pulled the old laminated photograph from his jacket pocket and held it up beside the actual table. The deep, distinctive scratch pattern was an exact match. This was the table. This was where Martin Hess had built the key that destroyed Clara's life 22 years earlier. But as Thorne moved his flashlight away from the bench, sweeping across the dusty concrete floor beneath it, his blood went completely cold. Hidden in the shadow of that heavy metal workbench was a solid steel trapdoor, set flush into the concrete foundation, sealed shut with a heavy industrial deadbolt. He signaled the tactical team. 2 officers stepped forward with crowbars and pried the steel door open with a screech of tortured metal, revealing a narrow wooden staircase descending straight down into the earth. A rush of stale, freezing air rolled up out of the darkness. The smell of damp soil, old rust, and something else Thorne couldn't quite name, something that made every instinct in his body scream danger. With his weapon drawn and his flashlight set to its brightest setting, Thorne began descending the stairs alone, into a silence so total it felt like walking into the inside of his own hell breath. When his boots finally hit the dirt floor at the bottom, he swept his light across the room, and what he saw there stopped his heart cold. The underground space was far larger than the shop above it, a sprawling, windowless cavern reinforced with thick cinder block walls, clearly built to ensure that absolutely no sound could ever escape to the surface. Directly in the center of the room, bolted deep into the concrete, stood a massive custom-built cage made of thick steel bars, roughly 8 feet wide, 10 feet long. Inside that cage sat a single rusted metal cot, its thin mattress heavily stained. A small plastic bucket sat in the corner. Thorne walked slowly toward the enclosure, his breath fogging visibly in the freezing air. He shone his flashlight against the cinder block wall directly behind the cot, and there, carved into the gray stone, were hundreds of deep, frantic scratch marks, the raw, undeniable physical evidence of a young mother fighting with everything she had left just to hold on to her own sanity in total darkness. As he studied the rusted frame of the cot more closely, he noticed something tucked into a hollow section of the metal tubing, a small folded piece of fabric. He pulled it free and unfolded it under his flashlight beam, a small, faded blue cotton shirt, a child's shirt. Thorne closed his eyes, a wave of pure emotional agony rolling through him. This was Julian's shirt, the one he'd worn as a 6-year-old boy. Somehow, on the night she was taken, Clara had managed to grab it, and she had held on to it through 5 brutal years in that cage, clutching against her chest in the dark, desperately trying to remember the smell of the little boy she'd been ripped away from. It was almost too much to bear standing in that room, but as a tactical officer spread out to search the rest of the basement, the true, horrifying scope of Martin Hess's existence began to reveal itself piece by piece. Against the far wall stood a massive industrial steel filing cabinet, stretching nearly 10 feet across the dirt floor. Thorne pulled open the first drawer and found it packed with hundreds of small brass house keys, each one meticulously organized on metal rings, each one tagged with a small handwritten paper label bearing a street address. The second drawer held clear plastic storage bins filled with stolen driver's licenses, wallets, and pieces of jewelry. The third drawer contained dozens of thick photo albums. Thorne opened the first one, and his stomach turned violently. Page after page of invasive Polaroid photographs, taken through the bedroom windows of unsuspecting women scattered across the entire state. The truth was finally laid bare in its full, sickening scope. Martin Hess wasn't a man who had simply become obsessed with one woman. He was one of the most prolific, undetected serial stalkers in the region's history, a man who had used his access as a maintenance worker and later as a licensed locksmith to secretly duplicate the keys to hundreds of homes. A phantom capable of walking through locked doors in the dead of night while entire families slept, stealing a photograph or a trinket and slipping away without a trace. Clara Higgins wasn't his only victim, but she was the one he had decided to keep. Thorne slammed that drawer shut, his hands shaking with a fury he could barely contain. The man who had built this underground hell was still alive, sleeping soundly in a trailer just a few miles away. He turned to the tactical commander and gave the order without hesitation. They were moving on the trailer immediately. The convoy sped to the dark rural highways as the freezing rain gave way to a full-blown blizzard, snow whipping violently across the windshields as the trucks turned onto a treacherous, deeply rutted logging path that plunged into dense pine forest. Property records showed Hess living entirely off the grid, in a small aluminum trailer at the very end of that road. The trucks cut their headlights a mile out. Officers moved through knee-deep snow in near-total silence, thermal goggles cutting to the blizzard, rifles raised. Through the trees, a faint yellow glow finally appeared. A single lit window, a thin stream of gray smoke rising from a small chimney pipe. He was home. The team formed a tight perimeter around the fragile structure. Thorne stood behind the lead breacher, holding his breath as the wind howled through the pines around them. He raised his hand, held it there for one long, unbearable second, then dropped it. The breacher swung the battering ram, and the trailer's flimsy metal door blew clean off its hinges with a crash that echoed like a gunshot through the silent forest. Police, get on the ground. Officers flooded into the cramped living space, flashlights cutting through thick cigarette smoke. Martin Hess was sitting at a small folding table, a cup of black coffee in front of him. 65 years old, gray-haired, ordinary-looking in every possible way. But when he looked up at the wall of armed officers surrounding him, his eyes were completely flat, dead, utterly devoid of surprise, fear, or any recognizable human reaction at all. He didn't run, didn't reach for anything. He simply set his coffee mug down, slowly raised both hands, and let 2 officers slam him face first onto the dirty floor, cuffing his wrist behind his back without a fight. Thorne stepped over the shattered door and looked down at the man responsible for 22 years of unimaginable suffering. Hess turned his head, pressed his cheek against the dirty linoleum, and looked up with a slow, chilling smirk. "You're 22 years too late, detective," he rasped. "The shop is empty." "We found her, Martin," Thorne said, his voice steady despite the weight behind every word. "Julian found her. She's alive, and she remembers your face." The smirk vanished instantly. All the color drained from Hess's weathered face, leaving him hollow, terrified, small. He understood immediately what that meant. That the perfectly hidden fortress he'd spent decades constructing around his life had just been permanently destroyed. Officers hauled him to his feet and marched him out into the raging blizzard, loading him into an armored transport vehicle. But Thorne wasn't finished. With Hess in custody, he needed to understand exactly what had happened in 1999, How had a woman locked inside a reinforced underground cage for 5 straight years managed to escape her own captor? He tore the small trailer apart methodically, ripping cushions off the sofa, emptying every cabinet, smashing through cheap wall paneling in search of hidden compartments. In the tiny back bedroom, thick with the smell of stale sweat and cheap liquor, he pulled a mattress off the metal bed frame and noticed something odd. The cheap linoleum flooring beneath the bed was scratched heavily, as though something extremely heavy had been dragged repeatedly across it. He grabbed a crowbar from a nearby officer, drove it into the seam of the flooring, and tore away, exposing the wooden subfloor beneath. A few hard strikes splintered wood open, revealing a dark cavity hidden between the floor joists, and inside it, a heavy iron strongbox. Thorne pulled it free and dropped it onto the floor with a metallic thud. It was secured with a heavy brass padlock. He didn't bother searching for a key. He raised the crowbar and brought it down hard, 3 times, until the lock finally gave way and shattered. Inside there was no money, no more stolen keys, just a thick, leather-bound journal. He lifted it out carefully and opened the cover. Page after page was filled with Hess's neat, meticulous handwriting, a horrifying daily ledger documenting every detail of Clara's 5 years in captivity. When he fed her, when he turned the lights on, how he had systematically tried to break her spirit, day after day, year after year. It read like the private scripture of a man who genuinely believed himself to be some kind of god ruling over a small, fragile world he built entirely underground. But as Thorne flipped toward the final pages, dated in early November of 1999, the tone shifted violently. The neat, careful handwriting dissolved into something frantic, chaotic, the ink smeared as though written by trembling, panicked hands. The final entry read simply, "She tricked me. She pretended to be broken. She waited 5 years. When I opened the cage to give her water, she didn't run. She didn't scream. She fought back. She is gone, and she took it with her." Thorne's heart slammed against his ribs. Clara hadn't just wandered out through some careless mistake on Hess's part. She had executed a calculated, desperate, violent plan, one that had required her to physically overpower a grown man in total darkness after 5 years of captivity and win. Reaching back into the strongbox, Thorne found one more object at the very bottom, wrapped in a faded, heavily blood-stained white towel. He lifted it out and unwrapped it slowly, and what he saw there completely rewrote everything he thought he understood about Clara's escape. Inside the towel was a thick, solid steel pipe nearly 2 feet long. Thorne recognized it instantly, one of the support legs from the rusted metal cot in the underground cage. The end of the pipe was badly dented, coated in dark, long-dried blood. Standing there in that filthy trailer, holding the weapon in his gloved hands, Thorne finally understood the full, breathtaking truth of what had happened that November night in 1999. Clara Higgins had not been a passive victim waiting to be rescued. For 5 brutal, isolated years in total darkness, she'd used nothing but her bare hands and an unstoppable, singular will to survive, slowly working with the steel legs of her cot loose from its bolts, rocking it back and forth, over and over, thousands of times, carefully hiding every bit of progress each time Hess came down those stairs to feed her. And when the metal finally gave way, she waited for her moment. When Hess opened a heavy steel cage door to bring her water, Clara didn't cower. She gripped that steel pipe with both hands and struck him with everything 5 years of rage and love and desperation had built inside her. The blow knocked him to the dirt floor, badly injured. But her plan didn't stop there. As Hess lay bleeding on the ground inside his own cage, Clara ran and slammed the heavy steel door shut behind her, trapping him inside. She grabbed his ring of master keys off the floor as she fled. She sprinted up the narrow wooden staircase, slammed the steel trapdoor shut behind her, and used his own keys to lock the deadbolt from the outside. Clara Higgins had buried her abuser alive, inside the exact prison he had built to hold her. Hess was trapped down there for days before he finally managed to pry the trapdoor open with a crowbar of his own. When he finally climbed out, he kept the bloodied pipe hidden in that box as a permanent, humiliating reminder that a mother he'd tried to break for 5 years had beaten him with her bare hands. Once free of the shop, Clara had run blindly into the freezing forest, starving, exhausted, wearing barely enough clothing to survive the bitter cold. driven entirely by the burning need to get back to her 6-year-old son. She ran until she reached the edge of County Road 9. But the highway was pitch black, and a commercial logging truck, rounding an icy bend, never saw her stumble out onto the asphalt. The impact threw her onto the frozen shoulder of the road, and the massive traumatic brain injury it caused erased her memory almost instantly. The truck driver stopped immediately, called an ambulance, and unknowingly saved her life. But when Clara woke up in the hospital weeks later, the damage was permanent. She couldn't remember her name, couldn't remember her past, couldn't tell anyone where she'd come from or what had been done to her. She became an anonymous Jane Doe, safely tucked away in a psychiatric facility, permanently out of Martin Hess's reach, though neither she nor anyone else would know that for another 17 years. Thorne carefully packaged the bloody pipe and the leather journal into evidence bags. The monster was finally in custody, and the physical proof of his crimes was now undeniable. The next morning, he drove back to the psychiatric facility to see Julian and Clara one more time. Julian was sitting beside his mother's bed, gently holding her hand, and Clara was watching him with a soft, peaceful expression, her blue eyes finally resting on the one face that had ever truly mattered to her. Thorne sat down and, with his voice thick with emotion, explained everything he'd found. The steel pipe, the broken cot, the brilliant, brutal trap Clara had set to lock her abuser away in the dark. Julian listened in complete silence, tears sliding steadily down his face. For his entire life, he had imagined his mother as a helpless victim, suffering in silence somewhere he couldn't reach. But hearing the truth of what she had actually done lifted something enormous off his soul. She wasn't a victim. She was a warrior. She had endured 5 years of unimaginable darkness for one reason only, to get back to him. Julian leaned forward and wrapped his arms around her shoulders, burying his face in her silver hair, kissing her forehead, whispering through his tears that she was the bravest person he had ever known in his life. Clara couldn't say the words back, but she squeezed his hand with a strength that surprised them both, and a smile broke slowly across her weathered face. The legal case against Martin Hess moved swiftly and decisively. Prosecutors presented the grand jury with an overwhelming mountain of physical evidence. The filing cabinets full of stolen keys and invasive photographs, the horrifying handwritten journals, and finally, the blood-stained steel pipe laid out on the evidence table. Facing the certainty of a highly publicized trial that would almost guarantee a death sentence, Hess's own attorneys advised him to surrender. He pleaded guilty to multiple counts of aggravated kidnapping, false imprisonment, and attempted murder. The judge showed him no mercy, telling him plainly from the bench that he was nothing more than a coward who preyed on the false safety of locked doors. Hess was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms without any possibility of parole and transferred to a maximum security state penitentiary. The man who had built windowless cages in the earth, now permanently confined to a small concrete cell of his own, forced to spend the rest of his life in the exact kind of isolation he had once forced on so many others. Clara's recovery afterward was slow, delicate, and, in its own quiet way, extraordinarily beautiful. Rebuilding a life after 22 years of trauma and amnesia is an almost impossibly difficult road, but she never had to walk a single step of it alone. Julian took legal guardianship of his mother, moving her out of the psychiatric facility and into his own home in Detroit. He converted his spare bedroom into a bright, calming sanctuary just for her, painting the walls a soft, peaceful blue and filling it with warm blankets and comfortable furniture. His years of experience as an emergency room nurse turned out to be exactly what she needed: the patience, the medical understanding, the deep well of empathy required to help someone heal from wounds most people can't even begin to imagine. He arranged specialized neurological therapy, occupational healing, and quiet, steady routines designed to help her feel safe one day at a time. Clara never fully regained the ability to speak in complete sentences, and the years before 1994 remained locked permanently behind the damage to her brain. But mother's love, it turns out, lives somewhere far deeper than memory. She learned to communicate through warm smiles, gentle squeezes of the hand, and quiet, easy laughter that slowly returned, month by month, like color coming back into a faded photograph. On a freezing Friday evening in late November, exactly 1 year after Julian had walked into that facility and found her, the two of them sat together on the warm carpet of his living room. Snow fell quietly outside the window, but the apartment was filled with a rich, comforting smell of melted cheese and baked crust. Julian carried a homemade pizza out from the kitchen and set it down on the coffee table, then turned on an old cartoon, recreating piece by piece the exact Friday night tradition they had shared when he was 6 years old. Clara smiled, picking up a slice, her blue eyes shining with something that looked unmistakably like peace. She reached out and rested her hand gently against his cheek. As her arm moved, the collar of her sweater shifted just slightly, revealing the dark, star-shaped birthmark below her collarbone. Julian looked at it and felt something enormous rise in his chest. Gratitude, mostly. Overwhelming, almost unbearable gratitude. That lucky star had actually worked. It had guided him through more than 2 decades of darkness, straight to a hospital room hundreds of miles away, and finally brought his mother home to the light. The story of the single mother who vanished into a winter storm, only to be found 22 years later because of one distinct birthmark, became a story people told each other in hushed, disbelieving tones for years afterward. It stands as a chilling reminder that predators can hide behind the most ordinary routines, using something as small as a stolen key to invade the one place people are supposed to feel completely safe. But far more than that, it stands as proof of something almost impossible to fully explain: the sheer, unbreakable power of hope and the unstoppable force of a mother's love. A monster can pick a lock. He can build a cage deep beneath the earth. He can try, for 22 long years, to erase a woman's very identity in the dark. But love, like a bright star burning somewhere far above the clouds, can never truly be extinguished. It waits patient in the heaviest silence. It survives the deepest isolation imaginable. And eventually, against every possible odd, it finds the strength to break through the iron bars keeping it from home. Time has a strange, persistent way of exposing every secret buried deep enough to think it's safe. No matter how far underground you bury the truth, and no matter how many years pass over in silence, love always finds its way back to the surface. It always finds a way to bring you home.